I thought my HOA was just strict, until a fake compliance officer showed up at my door, claiming I was under arrest. What I uncovered next exposed fraud, intimidation, and a secret scam the HOA didn't want anyone to see. The Willow Creek community had always prided itself on order, neat lawns, and a sense of harmony. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect suburban paradise. White picket fences lined the streets, sidewalks were immaculate, and homeowners went to great lengths to comply with every rule outlined by the HOA. Yet beneath the picture-perfect facades, there was tension simmering. Many residents whispered about sudden fines, strange fees, and the oppressive behavior of the board, but no one had dared to challenge them until Ryan Parker moved in. Ryan had lived quietly for a few months, following all the HOA rules meticulously. He painted his house within the approved color scheme, trimmed his hedges to perfection, and even paid his dues promptly. But what caught his attention wasn't a violation against him. It was the pattern he noticed across the neighborhood. Several neighbors, all friendly and approachable, had complained privately about new fees and unexpected fines. The charges were oddly specific: community security oversight, garden compliance fee, documentation handling fee. Yet when Ryan asked the board for clarification, he was met with vague responses, half smiles, and evasive explanations. Curiosity, combined with a sense of justice, drove him to dig deeper. He requested copies of the HOA's financial statements, an act that should have been routine, but he sensed reluctance in their response. When the statements arrived, they seemed suspiciously disorganized. Transactions didn't match receipts, and some vendors listed for maintenance or security services didn't exist. At first, Ryan assumed it was sloppy bookkeeping, but as he cross-checked the information with local business licenses and payment records, the truth started to emerge. The more he examined, the more alarming the discrepancies became. Several recurring payments were directed toward companies that had no office addresses, no valid licenses, and no real employees. Names appeared, disappeared, and sometimes reappeared in entirely different accounts. Ryan could trace the money, but the recipients were phantom companies, virtual entities created solely to siphon funds from unsuspecting homeowners. Among the transactions, one recurring vendor labeled Compliance Officer Oversight particularly caught his eye. It was a monthly expense, significant enough to warrant attention, but the vendor registration pointed to a private address belonging to someone closely related to the HOA president. It was no longer bookkeeping errors. It was a scam. Ryan spent the following weekend compiling everything into a detailed digital report. He labeled each entry, highlighted suspicious transactions, and noted discrepancies between reported expenses and actual services rendered. By Sunday evening, he had a clear pattern of financial fraud that implicated the HOA leadership. He was ready to take action. But just as he thought he had control, a creeping sense of unease gnawed at him. His discoveries were dangerous. Exposing them would provoke the board. Still, Ryan decided that silence would make him complicit. He planned to bring the evidence to a neighborhood meeting, and he also shared a few verified findings with trusted neighbors, enough to raise awareness but not enough to compromise his safety. The day after he finalized his report, Ryan was outside his house in the bright afternoon sun, tending to his front garden, when he noticed a figure approaching across the lawn. The man wore a crisp black uniform, a badge gleaming in the sunlight, and carried a clipboard that looked official at first glance. His stride was purposeful, his posture commanding. Ryan paused, studying the man carefully. The badge seemed slightly off, the lettering was not perfectly aligned, and the emblem looked cheaply embossed. Yet the uniform was convincing enough that any passerby might have assumed it was legitimate. The man stopped a few feet from Ryan and explained, without hesitation, that he was here for a compliance matter concerning the homeowner. As Ryan watched, the man claimed that he was authorized to enforce community rules, and that Ryan was under arrest for trespassing during HOA operations. It was absurd, impossible. Yet the man's demeanor carried the kind of intensity that made the situation feel urgent. Ryan's pulse quickened. It wasn't just the audacity of the claim. It was the chilling certainty in the man's voice, the way he moved as if he had authority over life and property. Ryan instinctively reached for his phone to record the encounter. The man's expression shifted, a flicker of panic crossing his face as he realized his authority was being questioned. Ryan demanded to see official identification, and the man became evasive, insisting that his orders were valid and that non-compliance would result in a hefty fine and temporary removal from the neighborhood. Neighbors began to appear from their homes, drawn by the commotion, yet Ryan remained calm, continuing to record every move. For a moment it became clear. This man was not a real officer. Something inside Ryan clicked. The badge, the uniform, the suspicious timing, they all pointed to one conclusion. The HOA was not merely mismanaging funds. Someone had sent an enforcer, a fake officer, to intimidate him into silence. The weight of the realization was heavy. This wasn't just a financial investigation anymore. It was personal. Someone in power had decided that his discoveries were dangerous enough to warrant intimidation and potentially harm. Ryan understood that what he had uncovered would not go unchallenged. The threat was real, yet he did not back down. He kept his phone raised, documenting every moment, aware that this recording could be his safeguard. The fake officer, noticing the growing audience and the lens of a camera, hesitated, unsure of his next move. Ryan's heart raced, not from fear, but from the knowledge that the first step in exposing the HOA's corruption had begun. The sun bore down on the quiet suburban street, but the tension was palpable. Neighbors whispered to one another, glancing nervously between Ryan and the man in uniform. For the first time, the illusion of control that the HOA maintained over Willow Creek cracked, revealing the lengths they would go to protect their scheme. The fake officer, realizing that the intimidation might fail, backed off slightly, but the silent warning was clear. This confrontation was only the beginning, and Ryan sensed that the fight to reveal the truth would escalate far beyond simple financial scrutiny. With the evidence in hand, the recording safely stored, and the first confrontation survived, Ryan prepared himself for what was to come. The scam had been uncovered, but the people behind it were willing to cross any line to maintain their power. The stage was set. The fake officer had come, the first warning delivered, and the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek would never feel the same again. After the first encounter with the fake officer, Ryan's life in Willow Creek changed overnight. What had once been a quiet, orderly neighborhood now felt tense and unpredictable. Every time he stepped outside, he noticed eyes peering from behind curtains, cars slowing down suspiciously as they passed, and neighbors whispering just a little too loudly. It was clear that the HOA, or someone acting on its behalf, had taken note of his investigation. The subtle intimidation had begun. Ryan spent the next morning reviewing the financial records again, trying to remain calm and rational. Each page of the spreadsheet reinforced his earlier conclusions. The HOA had been diverting money to fake vendors for months. The compliance officer oversight fees alone totaled tens of thousands of dollars annually. The accounts had been intentionally obfuscated, with multiple shell companies set up to prevent anyone from tracing the transactions directly back to the board. Ryan realized he now held evidence powerful enough to bring down the organization entirely. Yet the encounter with the fake officer was a grim reminder that simply exposing the fraud could come with consequences. He began to notice small changes around his home. Doors that had been slightly ajar, papers shifted on his desk, and once the faint sound of a car idling across the street in the middle of the night. Someone was watching, testing boundaries, and perhaps waiting for him to make a mistake. Ryan knew that confrontation was inevitable, but he refused to retreat as he prepared to send a carefully worded email summarizing his findings to the rest of the neighborhood. Ryan realized he needed allies. He quietly reached out to two neighbors he trusted, sharing only the verified portions of the evidence. Fake vendor names, missing invoices, and the suspicious compliance officer oversight charges. They were shocked but resolute, agreeing to help him document anomalies and keep track of HOA meetings and financial reports. Together, they began compiling a secondary record, a community log that could verify his findings independently. Meanwhile, the HOA board sensed unrest among the residents. Ryan's initial warnings had already prompted questions at meetings, and several residents were now openly challenging the board's decisions. The atmosphere at HOA gatherings became hostile. Board members grew defensive, speaking over residents and refusing to provide explanations for expenditures. Ryan attended these meetings quietly, observing, taking notes, and mentally preparing for his next move. He realized that the board's intimidation tactics were escalating in tandem with his actions. One afternoon, as Ryan was sorting through his documents in the living room, there was a sudden knock at the door. His pulse quickened. Opening the door, he saw the same tall man in the black uniform, the fake officer, standing there again. This time, the man was accompanied by another figure, equally imposing, who carried a clipboard and wore mirrored sunglasses. They claimed they were conducting an urgent compliance review and demanded to inspect his home, citing vague HOA rules about unauthorized record keeping. Ryan felt a surge of adrenaline but remained composed. He knew he could not allow them to intimidate him. He calmly informed them that he was documenting everything and that they had no legal authority to enter his property. The men's confident facade faltered slightly when Ryan raised his phone, recording their every movement. The first fake officer glanced nervously at his companion, then hesitated. It was clear that their plan relied on fear, not evidence. As they left without further incident, Ryan's awareness grew. These encounters were warnings. Each visit served to test his resolve, gauge his response, and intimidate him into silence. But instead of fear, Ryan felt determination. He realized that to fully expose the fraud, he needed more than spreadsheets and emails. He needed irrefutable proof, something that could not be dismissed or manipulated. Over the next few days, Ryan focused on surveillance and documentation. He discreetly installed security cameras to monitor the approach of any individuals in HOA uniforms. He kept detailed logs of his findings, noting dates, times, and specifics of each suspicious activity. The fake officers' repeated appearances became almost predictable. The neighborhood seemed to pulse with a silent tension, every resident aware that something was amiss but unsure of the exact threat. Then came the most disturbing discovery yet. A neighbor reported that the HOA had been quietly collecting personal information on residents, records of visitors, security footage, and even private correspondence. Ryan realized the scope of the board's power and the lengths they would go to control the community. This wasn't just financial fraud anymore. This was about surveillance, intimidation, and maintaining dominance through fear. Determined to act carefully, Ryan began compiling a detailed report, combining financial records, witness testimonies, and video evidence from his own cameras. Each piece of evidence was meticulously organized, labeled, and backed up in multiple locations. He knew that when the moment to confront the board arrived, he needed to be unassailable. But he also knew that the fake officer would not stop. The intimidation was designed to escalate. Someone had already risked committing a criminal act by impersonating an enforcement official, and Ryan had no doubt that further attempts to scare him were inevitable. The stakes were higher than ever. Not just exposing a scam, but ensuring his safety and the safety of the neighbors who had joined him in documenting the truth. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. The HOA's scheme had reached far beyond financial mismanagement. It had become an orchestrated effort to suppress dissent. Ryan realized that patience, careful planning, and unshakable resolve were essential. Each move he made would be observed, each misstep potentially exploited. But he was ready. The confrontation with the fake officer had been a warning, but it also strengthened his resolve. The neighborhood remained silent on the surface, but undercurrents of fear, suspicion, and quiet rebellion swirled. Ryan's allies, though cautious, were committed to helping him bring the truth to light. And as another evening settled over Willow Creek, he reviewed the growing dossier of evidence, aware that the next encounter with the fake officer, or someone even more dangerous, could occur at any moment. The battle lines were being drawn. The HOA's deception and intimidation were clear, and Ryan knew that exposing the scam would not be easy. But he was ready to fight. The days following the second confrontation with the fake officer felt heavy and tense. Ryan moved through the neighborhood with a heightened awareness, noticing every unusual glance, every parked car lingering longer than normal. Willow Creek, once serene and quiet, had transformed into a place where paranoia lurked behind manicured lawns and cheerful mailboxes. Ryan understood now that exposing the HOA fraud was not merely a matter of numbers. It was a battle of wits, strategy, and courage. Ryan began reviewing his evidence with meticulous care, knowing that even a small oversight could be used against him. Every spreadsheet, every email, and every recorded interaction was scrutinized, cross-referenced, and backed up. He had also begun documenting the HOA meetings in greater detail, noting any evasive answers, sudden dismissals, or attempts to silence residents. His camera system captured the comings and goings near his property, providing proof of suspicious behavior, and he even recorded the fake officer's movements during his previous visit. One afternoon, Ryan noticed something unusual. The fake officer was no longer subtle. He had begun driving through the neighborhood during the day, lingering near Ryan's house, watching from a distance, and occasionally pacing slowly along the street as if marking territory. It was an intimidation tactic, designed to unsettle and provoke fear. But Ryan was prepared. He kept his camera rolling, documenting every movement, while neighbors, previously hesitant, began observing and sharing their own encounters. The HOA's reach, once invisible, was now being exposed. Ryan realized that mere documentation might not be enough. He needed to find a way to flip the power dynamic. If the HOA relied on fear and secrecy, then public exposure could render their tactics ineffective. With this in mind, he organized a plan to gather indisputable evidence, both of the financial fraud and of the harassment. He reached out to a tech-savvy neighbor, asking for help in tracking the fake officer's visits and any unusual activity surrounding his property. They created a timeline, noting dates, times, and behavior patterns, building a comprehensive record of intimidation attempts. Meanwhile, the HOA board sensed that Ryan's influence was growing. Residents had begun asking questions during meetings, sharing observations, and even refusing to pay questionable fees until explanations were provided. The board's patience was thinning, and tension in the community rose with each unanswered query. Ryan noticed that the fake officer's appearances were becoming more aggressive, designed to catch him off guard and pressure him into submission. One day, the officer appeared without warning, stepping onto Ryan's driveway and claiming that an urgent compliance investigation required immediate access to his records. Ryan, aware of the officer's previous deception, calmly documented the interaction on his phone while keeping a safe distance. He ensured that neighbors were aware of the situation and ready to witness anything unusual. The fake officer attempted to intimidate Ryan with threats of fines and property restrictions, but the presence of cameras and witnesses weakened his power. The officer's confidence wavered, and after several tense minutes, he left without gaining compliance. Encouraged by this minor victory, Ryan took his plan further. He decided to compile a community-wide report, highlighting the fraudulent charges, the intimidation attempts, and the lack of transparency. He distributed digital copies to trusted neighbors and encouraged them to document their own experiences. Slowly, the fear that the HOA had maintained over the community began to erode. Residents, once silent and compliant, started questioning the board openly. The fake officer's intimidation lost its effectiveness as more people became aware of the truth. Despite these steps, Ryan remained cautious. He knew that the HOA could escalate their tactics further. Surveillance, subtle threats, and manipulation could still be deployed to silence him. But now he had allies, evidence, and a clear strategy. Each move he made was calculated, ensuring that any attempt to intimidate or silence him could be publicly documented. As the week progressed, Ryan noticed a shift in the neighborhood's energy. More residents were coming forward with their own evidence of irregular fees, questionable vendor payments, and instances where HOA rules had been misapplied or fabricated. It became clear that the board's power rested not in legality but in secrecy and intimidation. With that secrecy eroding, Ryan saw a path forward. One evening, he reviewed all his recordings and documents, preparing a consolidated report. The timeline of the fake officer's appearances, matched with the financial irregularities, painted a damning picture. It was a record that could withstand scrutiny, a record that would leave the HOA with no plausible defense. Ryan knew that the next step would require courage and precision. Public exposure. Ryan had turned the tables in subtle ways. The fake officer could no longer act with impunity. Residents were waking up to the reality of the HOA's corruption, and Ryan's documentation provided the proof needed to confront the fraud directly. The battle had shifted from intimidation to strategy, from fear to transparency. But the fake officer, though momentarily thwarted, remained a looming threat. The confrontation that would change everything, where the HOA would be publicly exposed and held accountable, was approaching. With months of meticulous documentation behind him, Ryan knew it was time to take decisive action. The evidence he had gathered, financial records, shell company information, video recordings of the fake officer, and eyewitness accounts from neighbors, was irrefutable. The neighborhood had grown restless. Residents whispered in small groups, comparing stories, sharing copies of suspicious HOA communications, and quietly expressing relief that someone had the courage to investigate. Ryan realized that timing was critical. Acting too early could allow the board to retaliate. Waiting too long could give them a chance to cover their tracks. Ryan spent several evenings organizing all the material into a comprehensive report. He created a detailed timeline of financial discrepancies, matched each payment to phantom vendors, and cross-referenced the fake officer's appearances with specific threats and intimidation attempts. Each piece of evidence was labeled and backed up, ensuring that nothing could be lost, deleted, or manipulated. He also made copies for trusted neighbors, ensuring that the information would remain in multiple hands. Once the report was ready, Ryan scheduled a community meeting under the guise of a neighborhood social gathering. The location was neutral, a local park pavilion, and attendance was voluntary. Flyers had been discreetly distributed, inviting residents to learn more about HOA fees and policies. Ryan anticipated a modest turnout, but as the day arrived, the pavilion filled quickly. Concerned residents, many previously hesitant to speak up, showed a renewed energy. There was a palpable sense of anticipation, a shared understanding that the neighborhood's normal order had been disrupted and that something needed to change. Ryan began the presentation with a calm but commanding narration. He walked neighbors through the financial irregularities, explaining how phantom companies had been created and how funds were being siphoned from the community. Each screenshot, invoice, and bank record was displayed on a large monitor, leaving no room for doubt. Residents murmured as they recognized patterns from their own bills, realizing the full extent of the deception. The turning point came when Ryan introduced the video recordings of the fake officer. The surveillance footage showed the officer approaching his property, attempting to intimidate him, and making threats regarding fines and community arrest. The crowd gasped as they watched, recognizing the boldness and audacity of the act. It was a moment of collective awakening. Neighbors who had been intimidated into silence now had visual proof of the lengths the HOA had gone to protect its fraudulent scheme. With the room fully engaged, Ryan handed out physical copies of the report to attendees. Residents began comparing notes, cross-referencing fees, and identifying additional instances of overcharges, fabricated violations, and unexplained penalties. The sense of unity grew. Individuals who had previously felt powerless now had the validation of concrete evidence, and their growing outrage was palpable. Word of the meeting spread quickly. Within 24 hours, multiple media outlets were contacting Ryan for statements. Local journalists, previously unaware of the internal HOA conflicts, now had a treasure trove of verified information. Ryan shared the full report, emphasizing that the fake officer's harassment and the financial fraud were interlinked, revealing a broader pattern of abuse of authority. Meanwhile, the HOA board grew increasingly desperate. The president, Reynolds, attempted to issue warnings about defamation and unauthorized distribution of HOA documents. But Ryan and his allies had anticipated this. Legal experts had been consulted, and the report was carefully crafted to avoid liability while clearly exposing wrongdoing. The intimidation tactics that had once silenced residents were now powerless against public scrutiny. As the days passed, more neighbors came forward with their own stories, reinforcing the narrative of corruption and intimidation. The HOA's attempt to maintain control was unraveling. Reynolds called an emergency board meeting, attempting to assert authority and minimize the fallout, but the presence of witnesses, combined with Ryan's thorough documentation, left the board unable to manipulate the narrative. Residents demanded answers, citing the evidence Ryan had provided. One afternoon, the fake officer returned, attempting to intimidate Ryan once again. But this time, the man was greeted by dozens of neighbors, all aware of his prior actions and recording everything. The audacity of the attempt backfired spectacularly. Police were alerted immediately, responding swiftly to ensure that no one impersonated law enforcement or attempted harassment. The fake officer was arrested on the spot, and his connection to the HOA president became the final piece of the puzzle. The public exposure of the scam reached a tipping point. Media coverage intensified, local authorities began investigations, and Reynolds faced mounting legal pressure. Residents organized to replace the board, demanding transparency and accountability. What had begun as a single homeowner's quiet investigation had escalated into a full-scale revelation of corruption, intimidation, and financial fraud. Ryan had successfully turned the tide. The HOA's carefully constructed veneer of authority had been shattered. Residents were empowered, evidence was irrefutable, and the board's fraudulent operations were exposed to the light of day. The fake officer was no longer a tool of intimidation, but a symbol of the board's desperation and unlawful conduct. The neighborhood, once fearful and quiet, now buzzed with determination and solidarity. Willow Creek would never return to its previous state of blind compliance. Ryan's meticulous planning, courage, and careful documentation had exposed the HOA's darkest secrets, setting the stage for legal action and the restoration of order under legitimate authority. The momentum Ryan had built could no longer be contained. Once the fake officer had been arrested, news of the scandal spread like wildfire. Local news channels covered the story, interviewing residents who had once felt powerless, but now shared their experiences with confidence. Social media amplified the narrative further, as footage from Ryan's recordings went viral. The community watched in awe as a system that had once held them captive through fear crumbled before their eyes. Investigators from the county's regulatory office arrived to conduct a thorough audit of the HOA's financial records. Every transaction Ryan had documented was scrutinized, cross-referenced, and validated. The shell companies, the phantom vendors, and the suspicious payments were all confirmed. The evidence was irrefutable. The board had been orchestrating a sophisticated scam for years, embezzling funds, and using intimidation tactics, including the fake officer, to suppress dissent. The HOA president, Reynolds, and several board members were placed under investigation. Legal notices were delivered, and they were barred from accessing HOA accounts or making further decisions. Residents gathered outside the board's offices, holding signs demanding transparency and justice. The community had reclaimed its voice, empowered by the courage of a single homeowner willing to uncover the truth. Meanwhile, Ryan and his allies worked with investigators, providing detailed logs, recordings, and witness statements. The authorities were impressed by the thoroughness of Ryan's documentation, noting that it had expedited the investigation and prevented further financial loss. Residents who had previously felt trapped by arbitrary fines and hidden fees now celebrated a sense of liberation. The HOA's reign of fear was ending. Despite the relief, Ryan remained vigilant. He knew that individuals who had benefited from the scam might attempt to flee, cover their tracks, or retaliate. He continued documenting everything meticulously, ensuring that no further attempts at intimidation would go unnoticed. The fake officer's arrest had sent a strong message, but the larger network of deceit needed to be dismantled fully. Legal proceedings began swiftly. Reynolds faced multiple charges, including embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit intimidation. Other board members were implicated as accomplices. Court sessions became public events, drawing media attention and community participation. Residents watched as each fraudulent action, each improper fine, and each intimidation attempt was presented before the court, supported by the detailed evidence Ryan had painstakingly gathered. As the hearings progressed, the HOA's credibility collapsed. Bank accounts were frozen, assets seized, and restitution plans were developed to reimburse affected homeowners. For the first time in years, residents felt a renewed sense of security, knowing that oversight and accountability had returned. Ryan's careful planning had ensured that the fraud could not be hidden or dismissed, and the community rallied together to rebuild trust and integrity. The fake officer, now in custody, revealed additional details about the board's operations, corroborating Ryan's findings. The investigation expanded, uncovering even more deceptive practices, including unauthorized surveillance, misuse of community funds, and attempts to intimidate other residents who had spoken out in the past. The network of corruption was extensive, but it had been meticulously documented, leaving little room for denial. Ryan's role in the exposure of the HOA scam earned him the gratitude of his neighbors. Residents organized a community meeting to honor his courage, acknowledging that without his meticulous investigation and steadfast determination, the truth may have remained hidden. Ryan, ever humble, emphasized that the fight was collective. Every neighbor who documented evidence, witnessed the fake officer, and refused to be silenced had played a vital role. Willow Creek had transformed from a community gripped by fear into a neighborhood empowered by transparency and collective action. The HOA's fraudulent board was dismantled, legal consequences were in motion, and residents had reclaimed their authority over community decisions. Ryan's persistence had not only exposed corruption but had united the neighborhood, creating a blueprint for accountability that would prevent future abuse. With the fraudulent HOA board dismantled and key players facing legal consequences, Willow Creek entered a new chapter of accountability and transparency. The air in the neighborhood felt lighter. The tension that had gripped residents for years slowly dissolved. Families who had once felt intimidated by arbitrary fines, hidden fees, and the looming presence of the fake officer now walked freely, discussing community concerns openly and confidently. The once dominant shadow of fear had lifted, replaced by a collective sense of empowerment. Ryan, though exhausted from months of investigation and confrontation, continued to play a key role. He worked with neighbors to ensure that the transition to a legitimate HOA board was smooth and transparent. New committees were established, including financial oversight, compliance review, and neighborhood relations, each accountable to residents rather than a closed circle of board members. The lessons learned from the previous regime informed every decision, creating structures designed to prevent future abuse. The legal system moved steadily. Reynolds and his co-conspirators faced trials for embezzlement, fraud, impersonation, and intimidation. The fake officer's testimony was crucial in linking the board members to the harassment campaign. Courtroom sessions were attended by residents, journalists, and legal observers, ensuring transparency and providing the community with direct insight into the consequences of the fraud. Each conviction reinforced the message that no one was above the law, no matter how carefully they cloaked their actions under authority. Meanwhile, Ryan continued to support residents in reclaiming their rights. Monthly neighborhood meetings now focused on constructive initiatives, neighborhood beautification projects, community events, and fair enforcement of HOA rules. Ryan also helped establish a secure digital archive for all HOA communications and financial records, accessible to every resident. This step ensured that future boards could not operate in secrecy, and that the neighborhood could remain vigilant against any potential misconduct. Despite the satisfaction of victory, Ryan remained humble. He acknowledged that the true power lay not in one individual but in collective action. Every neighbor who had witnessed, documented, and spoken out had contributed to dismantling a corrupt system. The fake officer's arrest, the exposure of fraudulent financial practices, and the legal consequences were all significant, but the broader achievement was the restoration of community trust. Willow Creek was no longer a place of fear. It had become a model of accountability and citizen empowerment. Reflecting on the months of tension, Ryan realized how easily communities could be manipulated through fear and secrecy. The HOA's misuse of authority had shown him the danger of unchecked power and the importance of vigilance. But he also recognized the resilience of residents who, once armed with information and courage, could reclaim control and reshape their environment. The neighborhood had grown stronger, bonded by a shared ordeal, and the knowledge that transparency and action were the most effective tools against corruption. As time passed, Willow Creek flourished. Community spaces were revitalized, local events fostered connection, and residents embraced a renewed sense of civic responsibility. The fraudulent board was permanently removed, new leaders were elected, and safeguards were firmly established to prevent future abuses. Ryan's meticulous documentation, strategic planning, and unwavering courage had not only exposed the corruption, but had laid the foundation for a safer, fairer community. In the quiet evenings, Ryan would sometimes walk past his property, observing neighbors tending their gardens, children playing in safe yards, and families gathering without fear of fines or harassment. The legacy of the fake officer, the fraudulent HOA board, and months of intimidation was now a story of triumph. The community had reclaimed what was theirs: their voice, their safety, and their trust in each other. The HOA scandal became a cautionary tale, shared beyond Willow Creek, illustrating the consequences of abuse of power and the potential for ordinary citizens to hold authority accountable. Residents now understood that vigilance, documentation, and collective action were essential in safeguarding their homes and communities. And so, the quiet homeowner who once faced intimidation, threats, and a fake officer standing at his door had emerged as a catalyst for justice. Ryan's perseverance had ensured not only his own safety but had transformed Willow Creek into a beacon of accountability, transparency, and empowerment, a neighborhood forever changed for the better.